o'clock.
Done, ma'am.
Hello and welcome to the fourth guest lecture of the online guest lecture series on Franz Kafka, organized by the Global Languages Center, OP Dengle Global University. The last lecture, we heard filmmaker and independent researcher Vaibhav Abnave. We got to know about Vaibhav's experience of making docufiction, I'm Only Making a Report, which comprises of three very distinct dramatic interpretations of Kafka's short story, A Report to an Academy. His attempt, he said, as a maker of this film, was in the Kafkian sense to report the abyss which exists, but cannot be fully accounted for. In order to understand his own praxis, he relies on Ladin Dollar's text, Voice and Nothing More, where he locates his position in the principle of oscillation, which is, he says, a peculiar curved space where one point passes into the other, where these points can neither be opposed nor be collapsed into each other. This principle of oscillation between documentary making and fictional filmmaking, between human, animal, and between theater, cinema, determined his work. Other aspects and challenges related to the different approaches adopted by the three artists who performed in German, Marathi, and English were also discussed. So with that, we already entered into the space of the art and the artist. Peter, while oscillating between his ape perception of humanness and his human perception of apeness, is transformed by default into a Künstler, an artist. By his artistry is neither thrilling nor soul-soothing. Rather, it merely lies in his ability to do what humans do, and apes usually do not. Peter suffers in order to become an artist, in overcoming his aversions and conditioning. Today, we shall discuss another of Kafka's artists, namely the Hungerkünstler, or the hunger artist. To help us understand the text, we have with us Professor Rajendra Dengle, who has been associated with the Center of German Studies of the Jawaharlal Nehru University since August 1979, and has taken up important administrative roles at the JNU, from chairing the Center of German Studies to his role as in charge of Central Library at the JNU, to becoming the Dean of the School of Languages, Literature, and Cultural Studies. His main areas of teaching have been theories of literature, history of German literature, modern German literature, phenomenology of literary communication, cultural studies. His research interests cover a span of diverse themes, such as the literature of fin des siècles, philosophy of language, comparative study of German and Marathi literatures, problems concerning literary translation and theories of the new media. He's translated many short stories into Marathi. Among his many publications in translation are his Hindi translations of Herta Müller, Der Mensch ist ein großer Fasan auf der Welt, and Atemschaukeln. Today, Professor Dengle will speak on the topic, Path Less Traveled, Complexity and Imagination in Kafka's shorter text. Professor Dengle, I want to thank you so much for accepting my invitation and to agree to deliver this talk. Many of us are waiting eagerly to listen to. The stage is all yours.
Thank you so much, Shruti, for these kind words of introduction. And I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to see all of you. And yeah, I'm grateful for this invitation to share some thoughts on the shorter texts of Franz Kafka, particularly on the Hungerkünstler, as we discussed, which I hope will help your students in the course of their engagement with Kafka. It's good to see Milind Brahme here, and I think Dr. Rosie Singh also should be here. They are the real Kafka experts, as I was saying. I am here just like that, you know. Okay. I'm also grateful to the previous speakers for their insightful presentations and discussions which followed, and which have undoubtedly provided me with fresh insights and inspired me to read Kafka again and about Kafka again after a gap of several years. What I'm going to offer to you is basically an absolutely unedited, loosely structured collage of an intertextual exercise. You know, there are no meandering, basically, you know, and but I hope something comes out of it, something comes out of it, of this engagement with the Hungerkünstler primarily, and some of the texts that I have read in the context. And I'm grateful to you, Shruti, for making me go through all this during my retirement, you know. But it was great fun, no doubt about that. I mean, I remember buying Kafka in English translation in the popular bookstore on Deccan Gymkhana. And it was, I think I got all the 3 novels together for, I think, 12 rupees or something in those days, you know. And popular bookstore doesn't exist anymore. You know, there is some sort of a fashion thing, a boutique or something, and so on. Lots of things in Pune have changed radically. Anyway, so I've sort of written a few things down, and which, if you would permit me, I would like to read them out so that, you know, I don't sort of wander off as, you know, and then difficult to come back. So it will hold me, in a sense, somewhat together. So I was wondering, if Kafka hadn't died at the early age of 41 and had continued to write into a ripe age of 65, 66, where I am now, whether the opacity and the mystery of the human birth had revealed more to him, whether his persistent struggle to come to terms with anxiety, shame, guilt, the feeling of being absolutely inadequate in terms of responding to the demands of modern life, his yearning for an exit out of the persistent exasperation and not finding it, except by writing within it, letting it express itself, creating images in language, whether all this painful turmoil would have spontaneously calmed down somewhat. The binary of opacity and imagination embedded in time had been thus, I'm putting it in quotes, transcended effortlessly, and the feeling of having arrived at his destination had become stronger as time had perhaps become more spatial. Milind Brahme, who teaches at Madras IIT, and we are fortunate to have him in our midst today, who teaches at Madras IIT, wrote an MPhil and a PhD dissertation in the 1990s at the Center of German Studies, engaging with the works of Kafka and the Marathi author G.A. Kulkarni. I was privileged to be part of both these projects, and it was, again, a wonderful thing to go through Milind's text all over again. So while he dealt with the thematic points of intersection and similarities in the works of these two alleged pessimists in his MPhil, he gave his PhD the title Wandern ohne Ankunft, which I would like to translate as Journeys into the Unknown. I was having a chat with Milind just the other day, and about how the Strindberg quote, which G.A. Kulkarni has as the motto for his life's works, had created the bridge between Kafka and G.A. Kulkarni. The quote goes as follows: "Shallow people demand variety. But I have been writing the same story throughout my life, every time trying to cut nearer the aching nerve, unquote. You can delete shallow people. I don't like it, but it's, just delete the shallow part, maybe. People demand, I would also imagine a conversation. This is my imagination. I would also imagine a conversation between Kafka and an Indian master, a Vedantin, perhaps. Someone who has, quote unquote, broken into reality, as Maurice Friedman would describe him, a guru, if you will. After all, you have to seek help of someone who knows, don't you? A conversation between a seeker coming from a Western country, sick of the life he is leading, scared of death, of committing suicide, in search of a solution to his problem, who wants to put an end to his misery but does not know how. The conversation about the truth of life would touch the question what it means to be born. Well, what a stupid question. I am what I am, this body, this mind, this name. Don't you see me? It is painful to hear that I am not the doer, but consciousness is the doer. Whenever matter organizes herself into a stable organism, consciousness spontaneously appears, is what the master says. And as consciousness appears spontaneously as I am, this I am is the inner child, the Jungian inner child, the wonder child, orphaned by no one, as it does not have any parents, but takes his physical parents to be his real parents, and the blame game begins. The inability to discern the nature of I am as a reflection or as a projection on the mental screen, an actor among actors playing a role assigned to him, emplotted and contributing to the movement of the plot in constant interaction with the other actors, as perhaps Wilhelm Flusser would call it, causes confusion and suffering. The real self and its projection, and the projection confusing itself to be the real self, are in perpetual conflict with the other, is the cause of the feeling of being alienated. And the Vedantin would say to undo this confusion is the purpose of yoga. The master doesn't claim to be an authority. His teaching welcomes evidencing. If you try honestly and find no inner evidence of the truth of what the master has been saying, you stop seeing him. It is similar to what happens when you read literature and try to create meaning for yourself with the help of a stranger's, the author's experience. Entfremdung is the experience. Verfremdung is what happens in the course of philological practice done with utmost attention and love. The Peter Andre Alt has written the biography of Kafka, which is called Der ewige Sohn, the eternal son. It was written in 2008. Let me see. Yes, here it is. This is it. And it's a wonderful piece, and he makes some great points in it, which I'll try and sort of summarily. In his preface, Peter Andre Alt differentiates between Kafka's reality, which he says was abstract in nature, an enormously large space filled with limitless power of imagination, and his outer world, limited in its expanse, which went on in and around Prague in a more or less matter of fact manner. See, I'm sort of referring to different German texts in German, and I have sort of tried to translate it into English. So I'm not sort of saying every time I quote and I unquote, because they may not be proper quotes, you know. So Kafka seems detached, but observant, attentive to what was happening around him. Even events of huge historical significance, such as the collapse of the Habsburg monarchy and the birth of the Czech Republic, do not inspire him to comment upon them. He maintains his distance to this outer world like a curious explorer, forscher is the term used here, explorer would to an unknown foreign territory. The complexity of the relationship between the inner and the outer, the observer and the observed, the self and the other, the subject and the object, the real and the fictional, the biographical and the literary, whereby the literary text mirrors this complexity, the fact that Kafka very often anticipated or prognosed his own vita, says André Alt in his poetic works, leads the biographer to problematize the thesis that literature imitates life by saying that Kafka imitated literature in his life. Simply put, Kafka observed his life in the medium of his literary production. Literary praxis conditions the way he experiences reality. Kafka's literary praxis transforms the world of experience into a space in which fantasy and reality cannot be separated. The biographer observes that Kafka cultivated the fear of his father in such an extremely obsessive manner that it became the primary condition of his life. He hesitates to grow up, and thus this eternal son who keeps wondering why he was condemned to be born, guilty of wanting to be born, fails in the practical world. For me, this Kafkaesque or this Kafkan law subverts the realist positivist logic of relationships. The triadic constellation of Kafka as the author who has language at his disposal with which he imitates or appropriates reality in order to find the law which governs his life, because this law is founded in an aesthetic praxis which is suspicious of the absoluteness with which the author, his experience of a reality existing independent of him, as well as the means with which he gives expression to his experience, are held to be independent of and separate from each other. And thus, André Art's thesis does not surprise that the pessimistic philosophy of Schopenhauer had had an influence on Kafka. Schopenhauer, for whom asceticism and aesthetic praxis were the ways out of the miseries and the suffering of life in this world, which, as we know, he defined as will and representation. Let me briefly relate Peter André Art's take on the Schopenhauerian influence on Kafka in the context of the Hungerkünstler. While on the one hand, due to his illness, Kafka adopts an ascetic attitude towards his writing, he does not succeed in maintaining it over a longer period of time. Writing once again takes over, but the focus shifts from shame, guilt, and punishment to the dangers of the life of the artist with its contradictions, escapist, and suicidal tendencies. André Alt cites several examples from literature written around the time which thematized the life of the clown, the entertainer, or the storyteller as the liminal figures within the setting of the circus or amusement parks. While situating The Hungerkünstler, in the midst of a writer's block that Kafka seemed to be going through while working on the castle, Andreas sees both the Hungerkünstler and Kafka as expressions of a crisis in the life of an artist. The visitors get bored with his Hungerkunst. The artist himself is no longer financially viable. The communication gap between his art and the public interest widens ever deeper, and the artist cannot anymore supply what he is expected to supply because he doesn't understand the nature of the demand. And so here Andreas finds the connection between Schopenhauer's pessimistic philosophy and Kafka's pessimistic anthropology. I quote, "With the melancholy image of the aging artist, Kafka's story shares the sorrow and mourns the loss of aura and the abandonment of the artist whom the public now ignores." Unquote. Now, I don't have a problem with the fact of an existential crisis in an artist's life, but I'm not sure whether the crisis of the Hungerkünstler, seen from his perspective, stems from whether there is public interest or not. He fasts because he cannot do otherwise. Is he not primarily concerned about finding the food which he would like to eat but cannot find? Does he not get upset about the 40-day time limit to his fasting? Obviously, it is ironic that he has to live in order to fast, and thus has to leave the impresario and find a job with a circus. But to make the success or failure of his art, I'm putting art in quotes, to make the success or failure of his art reception dependent is not being fair to him and to the nature of his quest. I think his actual problem is that he is forced to interrupt his journey and made incapable of actually crossing over to a space where to fast or not to fast is no longer a question. William C. Rubinstein, it's a much older text on the Hungerkünstler. William C. Rubinstein has a different take on the Hungerkünstler, wherein the focus shifts from the Hungerkünstler to the more abstract realm of art, literature, and communication. Quote, "In Kafka, we have the paradox of an artist who reached out to a public with which he evidently desired to communicate, while progressively moving further away from communication with the public." Unquote. Then a little later, he says, "The Hungerkünstler, written near the end of his life and first published in 1922, is one of Kafka's final statements on the condition of art in general and on his art in particular." Quote, "The hunger artist is the painter, musician, the poet who devotes himself ascetically to his art, an entertainment furnished by a man fasting. But paradoxically, those who keep a close watch on the artist are rewarded with a meal at the expense of the artist, a meal that the artist does not partake. The watchers whose job is to make sure that the Hungerkünstler does not cheat are mostly butchers. The nature of their task, we could call it their Erwartungshorizont, their mindset, their Vorurteil or prejudice, makes it impossible for them to understand him, and the Hungerkünstler has no desire to cheat. The artist who previously had believed that the public was cheating him of his reward now realizes that he doesn't deserve the admiration of the public. He has been driven to art against his will by a world in which he found it impossible to exist. Because life as he has found it has not been the food he liked. He has taken refuge in art. Hence his art has been a long fast from which he is dying, unquote. He's condemned to be an artist, condemned to his inner world, and whose aesthetic praxis reveals that he is his art's own judge and critic. This different, a Schopenhauerian Notwendigkeit der Kunst, the necessity of art, reveals not only a tension between the artist and his art, but also, more importantly, a peculiar inner tension between the idea of freedom and the medial, material limitation of its expression. A tension between the so-called higher self, quote unquote, the perfect artist, and the idea of perfect art, and the lower self, or the imperfect artist and his imperfect art, who as the medium tries to make this idea real. He's constantly being watched, judged, admonished, and convicted. The inner child continues to yearn for the love of his parent, who, through various agencies, urges him to give up his quest. But he is incapable of giving it up. This is the traumatic world of the eternal son, the artist. What is my crime that I'm punished like this? What have I done? Why do I internalize the crime that I honestly do not believe I have committed? The parent cannot answer such questions of the inner child because the parent is guilty of not only having to want to ask the same questions of his parent, but had no option but to suppress them and get on with life, as even his parents could not answer them. And so, the story of the eternal recurrence of the same goes on and on. This is Kafka's world, an auto-culpabilization machine, as Milan Kundera says. Quote, it's all a mistake. His entire life is a mistake, unquote, which reminds us of one of Brecht's Koiner-Geschichten. What are you doing, Mr. Koiner? He's asked. And Koiner says, I am preparing to commit my next mistake. Ich bereite den nächsten Irrtum vor, something like that. In Kafka, sorry. In Kafka, the person punished does not know the reason for the punishment. The absurdity of the punishment is so unbearable that to find peace, the accused needs to find a justification for his penalty. This Milan Kundera text is absolutely wonderful. The punishment seeks the offense. The accused seeks his offense by examining his whole life, his entire past, down to the smallest details. Unlike Tonio Kreuger of Thomas Mann, the Hungerkünstler does not produce anything. His quest, his hunger, can be interpreted as seeking an absolute relief from the bondage of self, as it were. Also, he doesn't become anything. If at all, progressively, he loses whatever one identifies oneself with, body, mind, soul. He doesn't consider his work as art. That is the function of the impresario. The world finds it amusing, even fascinating, but the whole thing is too abstract. And perhaps that is the reason why it is called art. But even the more puzzling and intriguing art than the hitherto known forms of art, which some peculiar outsider peripheral figures practice, and these are losers, for they cannot make it in the mainstream of life. I'm referring here to Colin Wilson's wonderful book called The Outsider, which has several examples across the board of such figures, including, I mean, it ends with Ramakrishna Paramahansa, and it sort of reminds me of, or takes me back to, or took me back then to Buber's and collection of ecstatic confessions, and so on. Incidentally, there is this, you can't do, but Buber has also read, I mean, Buber Kafka Connect is also there, but I will not talk about it right now. Okay, man creates systems and institutions, imagining that since they are perfect models, they will address all his problems and solve them, perhaps, because they are perfect. He begins to trust them. His faith in God or a power greater than himself shifts to these institutions, and they fail him. These are institutions created on the basis of a reason which has become instrumentalized and reified, as Adorno and Horkheimer have taught us. While Kundera argues that the Kafkan is not a sociological or political notion, that it rather represents one fundamental possibility of man and his world, a possibility that is not historically determined and that accompanies man more or less eternally, he shows how Kafka's works reveal that the one task that institutions such as marriage or family, with their private totalitarianism, seem to fulfill perfectly, is to judge imperfection and punish it by using the technique of culpabilization. In Kafka's world, this totalitarianism is absolute. Even things produced by this machine inadvertently and involuntarily become instruments and practice and terrorize man. Andreas Herter's text, Duplick, der große Schwung der Abwendung. I mean, I found it very exciting because he's talking about the Turmuhr and the Taschenuhr, you know, and how the two show different times and which is completely internalized. And the traveler feels guilty that his time, his pocket watch, is not showing the time which it ought to as the clock tower, you know, and that's why he misses the train. Anyway, let me just see what I put it. Has drawn attention to his analysis of Gibbs Auf, to the fascinating relationship of power and tyranny, the fear and desperation and the guilt of having done something terribly wrong. What's that? Terribly wrong. Because the traveler's pocket watch shows a different time from the clock tower clock, thus causing him to miss his train and therefore to find solace in the policeman's presence, who the traveler in an unknown town believes will show him the right way, but who advises him to forget it, to give it up. Kundera quotes Jan Skacel, I hope I pronounce it correctly, the Czech poet. It's a beautiful poem, so I just wanted to, it's a very short poem. It says, poets don't invent poems. The poem is somewhere behind. It's been there for a long time. The poet merely discovers it. Applied to Kafka's works, he says, Kafka made no prophecies. All he did was see what was behind, thus becoming transparent to the opaque where the poem is. Writing then is allowing this opacity to express itself in complex images, which have then the power to inspire the recipient to become transparent to the opaque within himself where the poem is. Is this poem something out there or in there, or is it more of an, or is more of a matter of intuition? That there must be something which makes this life meaningful and worth living. What is this whole business of creating meaning for myself by trying to make the experience of someone else comprehensible for myself? We read in Andre Alt about the abstract nature of Kafka's work. I see in Milind Brahme's dissertation also a reference to Hermann Brock's comment on Kafka, which also emphasizes this point. Quote, Kafka is disgusted with both the inner and the outer world. Therefore, it is not hope or belief of finding something greater within. It is abstract art in the most non-theoretical sense. He transcends the borders defined by the established discipline of literature studies. It is neither romantic nor existential, unquote. Josef Strelka, in his piece titled On the Kafkaesque Elements in Contemporary Prose, however, argues for finding a location for Kafka within the literary history. I quote, Kafka cut out all needless ornaments, but what he avoided most, if not all, accidental, individual, realistic elements, and aimed only at the essential of the human situation. He used his own life experiences as a model for the human situation, and it becomes clear how subjective sincerity combined with a high level of intellectual reflection comes closer to truth than most realistic and objective, abstract, outside reflections. It is to a large extent the anti-naturalistic, subjective absolutism of the expressionist mode which found in Kafka's its classical representative, unquote. Milind Brahme has argued on similar lines by citing Hermann Bahr's idea of an extended naturalism or erweiterter Naturalismus. Strelka, from whose book Brecht, Horvath, Dürrenmatt, I have learned a lot, discusses in his piece on the Kafkaesque elements. Now, The Woman in the Dunes, a novel by Kovo Abe. I'll just show it to you. This is the novel in Penguin. It's called The Woman in the Dunes. A novel by Kovo Abe, written in 1964, an example of what an indirect influence of Kafka. So these beautifully written. As an example of what an indirect influence of Kafka. Now, if you have not read this book, this absolutely wonderful book translated into English by E. Dale Saunders, with illustrations by Kovo Abe's wife, Machi Abe, and an introduction by David Mitchell, the author of Cloud Atlas, or seen the most astonishingly beautiful black and white film directed by Hiroshi Teshigahara also in 1964, I would urge you to do both, if I may. It is the story of Nikki Jumpai, who is a teacher and an insect collector, an entomologist. He hopes to discover a new type of beetle, an unknown type of beetle in a dry riverbed. This beetle has escaped him. Am I audible, Shruti? Yeah. This beetle has escaped him because of the confusing pattern of its flight. According to one theory, this strange pattern of flight is a snare for the purpose of enticing small animals away from their nests. Prey such as mice and lizards are lured out in spite of themselves, wander into the desert, collapse from hunger and fatigue, and are eaten by the beetle. In the same way, the insect collector is lured out into the desert-like landscape of the dunes at the seashore, where he finds a strange village, which seems to have become a rising slope because of the sand piling up, driven in by the wind. Only the small houses remain on their original level. They seem to be sunk into the hollows scooped in the sand. An old man of the village promises to help Nikki find a room in one of the houses. There is a ladder leading down into this house, which belongs to a woman. Nikki finds the next day that a ladder is gone. He has been kidnapped, trapped in this house with this woman, and is supposed to help her shovel the new sand which the wind drove in into kerosene cans, which the villagers lift up in buckets. Nikki tries several times to escape and fails. During one of these attempts, he stops and wonders, quote, how far had he come? He had already run up and down several dunes. Yet the more he strained, the more he seemed to be running vainly, dreamily, in one place alone. He surrenders, accepts, builds a trap to catch crows, which he gives the name Hope, begins to sleep with the woman, experiments to find ways of preventing fresh water from evaporating, storing it, and thus becoming independent of the villagers up there. In other words, he becomes creative. Quote, monotonous weeks of sand and night had gone by. Hope, as before, lay neglected by the crows, and the bait of dried fish had become not even that. Although spurned by the crows, it had not been spurned by the bacteria. One morning, when he felt the end of the stick, he found that only the skin remained. The fish had turned into a black, almost liquid pulp. As he was changing the bait, he decided at the same time to check on the contraption. He scraped away the sand and opened the cover. He was thunderstruck. Water had collected at the bottom of the bucket. At that depth, there could be no underground spring, and he was obliged to recognize that the escaping water was being constantly replenished from somewhere. The woman gets pregnant and has to be lifted up and taken to the hospital by the villagers. Nikki finds that they have not removed the ladder. The ladder is still there. But I'm not going to tell what happens next. What has happened here? Has the will to escape life miraculously transformed into acceptance? I'm going to talk a little bit about Irving D. Yalom's The Schopenhauer Cure. You might have read Irving Yalom's When Nietzsche Wept or seen the film. Apart from this book, he's also written a book, a novel, beautiful novel, again, the Spinoza Problem, and in this series, as it were, the Schopenhauer Cure. How can a philosophy known to be pessimistic become part of a cure? What is the nature of the disease, the madness, and the cure that Schopenhauer could possibly offer? Could this put André Arld's position about Schopenhauer's influence on Kafka and his pessimistic anthropology, as well as the crisis in the life of an aging artist, as manifested in the figure of the Hungerkünstler, in a different perspective? As a practicing psychoanalyst, therapist, and a novelist, Yalom draws our attention to Schopenhauer's Parerga and Paralipomena, 2 volumes which Schopenhauer completed in 1851, 9 years before his death. Quote, with a profound sense of accomplishment and relief, he finished his book and said, I will wipe my pen and say, the rest is silence. Unquote. Yalom summarizes the phronetic shift in Schopenhauer's philosophy in the course of 3 essays: what a man is, what a man has, and what a man represents. I quote, in his final work, he softened his pessimism and offered wise instruction on how to live. Though he never renounced his belief that life is but a useless, disturbing episode in the blissful repose of nothingness, He took a more pragmatic path in Parerga and Paralipomena. We have no choice, he said, but to be condemned to life and must therefore attempt to live with as little pain as possible. Schopenhauer always viewed happiness as a negative state, an absence of suffering, and treasured Aristotle's maxim, not to pleasure, but to painlessness do the prudent aspire. This introduces a new tone, Yalom argues, while it continues to emphasize the tragic and lamentable suffering of existence. It adds the dimension of connectivity, very important point. This introduces a new one, Yalom argues, while it continues to emphasize the tragic and lamentable suffering of existence, it adds the dimension of connectivity. That is, through the commonality of our suffering, we are inexorably connected to one another. In one remarkable passage, the great misanthrope displays a softer, more indulgent view of his bipeds. Quote, the really proper address between one man and another should be, instead of sir, my fellow sufferer. However strange this may sound, it accords with the facts, puts the other man in the most correct light, and reminds us of the most necessary thing: tolerance, patience, forbearance, and love of one's neighbor, which everybody needs and each of us therefore owes to another, unquote, unquote. It is ironic that the very book in which Schopenhauer described the folly of pursuing fame made him famous, and this is hilarious, and one cannot but laugh at the tricks the fate plays. We have been talking about Hungerkünstler. We read in Yalom's book that the famous Schopenhauer, curious visitors flocked to the Englischer Hof to eye the philosopher at lunch. In Han Kang's book, The Vegetarian, which some of you are familiar with, we have in the figure of Yong Hei, another celebrity Hungerkünstlerin, a rebel in spite of herself. This is the Han Yang book, which Shruti and I briefly discussed a few. The only explanation she has when her dumbfounded husband and other family members want to understand why she has suddenly decided to go off meat is, I had a dream. I feel this is not the right place to go into this wonderfully multi-layered novel and its nuanced cultural critique. In the present context, however, it is interesting to see, this is towards the end of the novel, that Yong Hei, now completely isolated and left with no desire to live, has a fellow sufferer in her sister, In Hei, in the sense we spoke of earlier. In Hei, while attending to her insane sister in the hospital, continues to be concerned about her child, whom she has left with a lady next door. She thinks, quote, Jae-woo will be grown up soon. He'll be able to read on his own, see people on his own. Somehow or other, he will inevitably get to hear about all that happened. And how on earth will she explain it to him? He's a sensitive child, prone to minor illnesses, but he's also a happy child. How will she make sure he stays this way? And in Hei, who has lost faith in everything in life, because her sister, and her husband, the artist, they've had an affair of sorts. So in Hei, who has lost faith in everything in life since she has become aware of the strange relationship between her artist husband and her sister, has become suicidal, just like her sister. But strangely, she remembers a walk down the mountain path early that morning, the dew that wet her sandals and chilled her otherwise bare feet. There had been no tears, nothing like that, because at that time, she had not understood. She hadn't understood what the cold moisture had been trying to say as it drenched her battered body and spread through her flesh down to her very bones. There is a shift in her perception of reality, she realizes. She wants to say yes to life in spite of whatever way she might have thought life had treated her. And this transformation, this change makes her say to her sister, perhaps this is all a kind of dream. But then, as though suddenly struck by something, she brings her mouth right up to Yonghei's ear and carries on speaking, forming the words carefully, one by one. Quote, I have dreams too, you know, dreams. And I could let myself dissolve into them, let them take me over. But surely the dream isn't all there is. We have to wake up at some point, don't we? Because then she lets the sentence hang, she doesn't complete it, and the novel ends a couple of sentences thereafter. The idea of the fellow sufferer reminds me of another novel by Marion Poschmann, Die Kieferinsel, the story of two men, one young, one not so young, a man from Germany, disgusted with his life, escapes to Japan, probably having heard of Aokigahara, the popular site to commit suicide, but finds in Basho a renewed desire to live, finds a young man at the metro station about to jump in front of the train, stops him, and the two losers embark on a hike. In his fascinating book on Kafka, which is a demonstration of what the praxis of intertextuality should look like when you are trying to make sense of what an author has been trying to say, writing the same story throughout his life, every time trying to cut nearer the aching nerve, Walter Benjamin asks the question, where aber war Kafka? While describing Kafka's world as world theater, with men and actors always on stage, with no special talent for acting, they are only expected to play themselves. Benjamin sees them in their roles seeking to become part of Naturtheater, nature theater. They want to belong. Like Pirandello's 6 characters, Kafka's characters are also in search of an author. And this author is salvation, says Benjamin. Since they do not find him, there is shame. The most basic and the most powerful emotion in Kafka's works. But this is shame. I'm just translating Benjamin here. But this is shame, but this is shame in a, but this shame is different, sorry. This shame is different in the sense that it is not just about being ashamed before or in front of the others, but also to be ashamed for them. There is nothing personal about Kafka, neither his life nor his thinking. To him, it is as if he were living and thinking under coercion of a family, this unknown family, because of which and from which he can never find release. We don't know how this family came to be, who its members are, only that it is this family which compels Kafka to bring the world theater into motion. But the most profound point that Benjamin, that was, so end of quote, but the most profound point that Benjamin makes with Willi Haas is what the actual hero of this drama is. The actual held, the hero, is forgetting. Noun, forgetting. A peculiar forgetting, not the forgetting of individual human beings, but forgetting as the human condition itself. A forgetting which has forgotten itself. The characters are trapped in the in-between world, and Kafka's stories bring this entrapment to light. Therefore, who or what is born is this memory of, so that seems to be his thesis. Therefore, who or what is born is this memory of forgetting. Seen in this light, there is once again an opening, a possibility to depersonalize shame and guilt, to overcome the idea of being condemned, being a victim, and perhaps a new awakening. There is in Andre Arlt's Kafka biography a smaller chapter titled Negative Dialectic, in which he quotes from Kafka's diary, which provides a rare insight into Kafka's understanding how art works. So there is this quote, and then I'm coming to more or less about to close. Kafka's understanding how art works. After attending an evening of Yiddish songs, Kafka writes to Flora Klug, quote, "The Talmudic melody of exact questions, invocations, or explanations, the air enters and blows through a pipe, carrying the pipe along with itself, whereas for the addressee of humble and distant beginnings, it's like a huge screw, by all appearances proud, but humble when it turns and twists while boring into him." An instruction manual seems to be inbuilt in Kafka's stories, which common sense finds difficult to work with. To reduce them to one meaning and hold them there would be to destroy their logic, which not only welcomes, but rather insists on an openness which resists all lethal reifications. Kafka remains conscious of the fact that all traces of rapprochement, I'm translating Andre Arlt here, that all traces of rapprochement which imagination makes possible, overcoming of the fight between life and death, body and mind, the I and the community, are illusions. Therefore, even the early texts offer no clear explanations, but descriptions of explanations. No clear explanations, but descriptions of explanations. The process of interpretation is for them an object of observation. By making the hermeneutic process self-reflective, methodologically speaking, they follow the same, he uses the term Erkenntnispsychologie of Nietzsche. A consistent referentiality of a stable order gives way to a multi-layered, broken description of the act of understanding. Very difficult to translate these German things of Andre Arlt here, but I thought that they summarize a few points beautifully. The act of understanding. What it conceals is the incommensurable play of an absolute meaning, as that foolishness of interpretations, which, like in a hall of mirrors, show the thousand faces of modernity. While writing this, I often remembered Faust's obsessive quest to experience that one moment which will reveal to him the mystery of this world, to find that one principle that holds the world together. Should he find that, that would be beauty itself. He will not and cannot pay heed to the wisdom and advice of Mephistopheles, that he should accept his humanness and give up his quest. Allein ich will, he says. Such is the nature of the Hungerkünstler's madness. Es irrt der Mensch, solange strebt. Man errs as long as he strives, says God in the prologue in heaven. But this irren, this being in the wrong, is part of his plan, If you accept that God is the doer in the final instance, then the whole scenario changes. Then the Hungerkünstler, the impresario, and the whole Kulturindustrie discourse, the cage, the watchman, the two ladies, the diminishing public interest, the panther, with all the wonderful symbols and their significance, all of these become pieces of colorful glass interacting with each other, reflecting each other endlessly within a self-generating kaleidoscope. Each time you separate any one of these and make it the subject of the movement and the creation of the changing visuals on the screen, you are going to have a different design, equally opaque each time to the reader, each time inspiring the reader to use his power of imagination. I thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much, Professor Dengle. This was indeed, enlightening to say the least. There were so many points that you've raised, very important points. Your collage, I'm very used to listening to you and to the rich references that you always make. You know, it has given us a very broad perspective into something that we thought was one would tend to discuss in a very one-dimensional, unidimensional way. So, I'd like to just quickly point out a couple of points that came up. We started with a discussion. I like the way you started with what if Kafka had lived longer, would he have had the time to make his art more spatial, you said. You also mentioned G.A. Kulkarni, and you said, well, shallow people demand variety, and it is the true artist who actually would rather cut nearer the aching nerve, which is actually very close to the idea of suffering, that as art, which is so paramount to the hunger artist. We talked about imagination and opacity. So these were the two very important points. And I think that's what you also then beautifully developed in the text, in the matrix of your talk. My question would be related to the concept of suffering and Schopenhauer. When we talk about will in Schopenhauer, will and imagination, these are the two terms that are important, die Welt als Wille und Vorstellung. You chose to say opacity instead of will. This is very interesting because on the one hand, when we try and understand Schopenhauer seems to say will is, as per the Buddhist philosophy as well, will is the root cause of all pain and suffering, and hence that is something that one has to also suppress or one has to do without. And that's why I think when we talked about the pessimism in Schopenhauer, that's what one understands basically, because he seems to be proposing that we say no to will in order to understand this. However, when you went on and you spoke about happiness, that how happiness is actually important to Schopenhauer in another very important text. So there is definitely a lack of understanding of Schopenhauer's understanding of will, first of all. I think I would like you to comment on that. And how do you connect this will or lack of will or diminishing of will to opacity in Kafka? Why do you say opacity? How is he opaque? You have obviously delved on it and we have heard you as well, but if you could just connect the two dots for us, please. That would be my first question to you, please.
Thank you, Shruti. Well, I was looking more at, reflecting on this notion of pessimism, and Schopenhauer as a philosopher of pessimism. You have to, I, speaking for myself, understand pessimism if you relate it to my understanding of the human subject, then perhaps the idea of pessimism becomes a little more ambivalent, and you heard, I think, what my reading of Benjamin also, what gets born basically is memory. It seems that there is a memory body, which is there, and it gets born, as consciousness, and so on and so forth, So I don't want to be vague, but what remains. See, opacity is there. I want to try and find ways and means to access it. The more I try and access it, the more opaque it becomes. you know, it's a never ending kind of a story, you know. And that is why but the idea is, to me, that let it be opaque. I should not allow my imagination to die. You know, that imagination should be kept alive. That is something which, you know, and then because that opacity has innumerable possibilities and potential. You know, if I insist on giving one meaning to that opaque, saying that, look, this particular thing means this, and imagine that the riddle of opacity has been solved once and for all, I would be wrong. And that is what Kafka is showing, I think, you know, that this time and again you try and go near to this, and you think that it has been solved, like you finding a policeman and said, now I am sort of saved, you know. And what does the policeman say? You know, he says, you give it up, you know, forget it. For me, I will still then wake up, and so on. So, but I see the pictorial turn and so on and so forth. We talked about it in another context, you know, this opacity and making it visible, how the opaque came into being in the first place. You know, that opacity, to make that visible and experientiable is what is, I think, important. And this is something which the parent of this, you know, in Andre Al's thing of the child also, and so on and so forth. Why does this memory perpetuate itself? It is because that competence is lacking, this competence to imagine and take the risk of coming closer to the opaque. If that were to happen, there would be the possibility of a different kind of relationship between the parent and the child. You know, see, in the Hunger Künstler, for instance, there is public watching him, the children are clapping and so on and so forth. You know, no one asks him anything about anything. Why are you doing this? No one. There is absolutely no dialogue of any kind, you know. So all those things are, so basically he is the absolute, again, he's also been caged and so on and so forth, you know. So there is not a single person in the public who has this imagination to address the opacity of this, you know. They sort of let it remain as it is, but allow their imagination, power of imagination, Fulser calls it Neue Einbildungskraft, also to die out, you know, and they're happy, you know. And so when they find that, you know, this is just too much now, every day we watch the same thing, so they lose interest in it, and so on and so forth. But I think what is perhaps in the Hunger Künstler for me, what came out with this whole thing was that he is made to turn inward. He's not looking out anymore, and he realized that this this tyranny of the higher self, the artist, in sitting in judgment over the lower self, is within him. So this technique of culpabilization is within him. I mean, and it is being practiced. This has to end, you know. This has to end in order that there is, you know, Jung would call it, because it's a Jungian notion, that you would call it individuation, you know. So you become whole in that the difference between the parents sitting in judgment over this imperfect child time and again, and the child trying time and again to become perfect, and so on. This entire thing comes to an end, you know. What happens is something which you cannot foretell, but it is definitely something where the child is not going to suffer. You know, what these two sisters say in Han Kang's novel, you know, is basically, I mean, it's quite amazing. This one sister, you know, she knows that her husband is having a relationship with her sister, and doesn't want to live, and she's going to abandon her child, but she's tending to her sister in the hospital and thinking of her child. And what is how does this happen? No one can say. This shift, how does this happen? I mean, you have made up your mind. You want to divorce your husband. You want to abandon your child because, and so on. What would have happened to that child? So this, I think these are questions related to the practical import of my reception of Kafka today. This is it's very important. I mean, it's certainly not the way I read Kafka, whatever 40 years ago or whenever it was. Never gave thought to this business of what would have happened had someone from the public asked the Hunger Künstler a question, and how would he have responded? Would he have, So that, I think, has to be kept open. And if I keep it open, I have a wonderful time with Kafka.
I was very tempted to, in fact, I had this feeling that you were perhaps also leading towards Nietzsche in taking the word opacity, because the will to power in a certain way is actually a will to resistance as well. And when you're saying Kafka imitates literature in his life, it is as if he's using literature as a tool to create this opacity. He's creating it on purpose. Even the Hunger Künstler is not, he is hurt initially, he is affected by the other, his reception or perception of the others, for example. And after that, it doesn't really matter anymore. He is just, he and his art, they become one, for example. Yeah, and that is the beauty of it. I think that's the resistance, the beauty of resistance that one can see here. And that's why I felt, that there is a certain answer in our discussions, in our course. We kept saying, why is Kafka so negative? Why doesn't he have any solution to the problems? And there we had such beautiful answers, and I think you've also answered it so beautifully, that it is actually in the act of writing, in the act of creating, that also is important. The entire essence of Kafka actually lies. That's there in accepting the self, so to say, and not playing the blame game, not getting into the eternal recurrence of the game, the blame, that in the Jungian sense, would it be something? I mean,
I think so, yes.
Am I on the right track? Yeah.
Well, I mean, it may sound like whatever new age philosophy, this, that, and the other, but so be it. I don't care, because to insist on some sort of a theoretical thing in order to address Kafka is not enough. That is my feeling. Kafka's the opacity of his images have the power to inspire me to imagine. What all can I imagine with Kafka? Why should I otherwise read Kafka? And someone who's taking me to a dark space, someone who is pessimistic, someone who wants to make me suicidal. Is that the reason why I read Kafka? I have to ask these questions courageously of myself when I'm reading Kafka, And this is why I'm saying all these things, is because you have a group of students, they are engaging with Kafka's work and so on. I mean, is it under some sort of compulsion that Kafka has to be read because of part of syllabus and so on? No, Kafka continues to charm you. It is important to find out what are the possibilities. Everyone will find something else,
Yes, thank you so much.
No.
I'd like to please request the others now who have also listened to you as keenly as I have, to please put up their questions or share their, Amelia, please.
Thank you so much. I just had one question. While I do understand we should not impose our own restrictions on Kafka's work, but I believe that the fact that Kafka lived in the times of the World War I and the World War II, and it's the age of paternalism, as was rightly pointed out, that even in the Hunger artist, there's this sort of paternalism, this sort of higher artist. So could it be said, I understand I am going against the whole purpose of this talk when I say we're putting this whole interpretation of the World War I or World War II, but could it be said that Kafka's work was inspired by this by his environment, which was the world was this warish, brutal times. Thank you so much.
It's a question which I don't know. Kafka researchers, do you have an insight into this? The thing of causality, what causes Kafka to write the way he wrote? Yeah, Milind, I think it's.
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Raju, and thank you, Shruti, for making this happen. And this was wonderful to listen to Raju talking about Kafka after a long, long time. But one thing that Raju mentioned in the talk, just to come to Milia's question, was also the fact that the triad between the writer and the reality are outside of him. I mean, he talks about Kafkan reality or Kafka's reality, which is very abstract, but there is a reality outside of, which I think Milia is referring to, and then the language that the writer instrumentalizes in order to package this reality into a work of word art. So I think this triad is problematized, at least, if not dissolved in Kafka. And in a sense, what I would like to say is that the turning inward, which Raju also spoke about, I think to answer Milia's question, the turmoil outside and the turmoil inside are no longer separate, in a sense, and that is why, although in order to come back to Kundera, who says that the Kafkan is not a sociological notion, but a fundamental human possibility in this world, I think that's a very important point, because it is this totally sincere subjectivity or honest subjectivity that allows the writer to discover the entire chaos around him, also within him. And therefore, then the writing becomes not only, I mean, it is neither existential nor romantic, as I think Andre Altes said, or who, I'm not sure now whose quote that was.
That was Rubinstein, I think.
Rubinstein's quote, yeah. So, am I getting somewhere with this? That there is a that, of course, the entire chaos of the time, we cannot. I mean, when we do a text Auslegung, or when we do when you approach the text, Kafka as a text, that time we cannot simply ignore the fact that he lived in those times. But I mean, I think I would refrain from making a direct causal link with that, because in my work I have contrasted Kafka's reality with G.A. Kulkarni's reality, where you cannot probably establish this kind of a causal relationship between what was happening outside and what the writer was writing, and yet there is in the reader's experience, there is so much of commonality, there is so much of what is it called, Berührungs affinities in the reading experience. So I hope that gives. There is one thing, if I may, on the question of opacity that you and Raju were talking about, Shruti. I remembered, if I may quote Ghalib in this context, I remembered one of Ghalib's shares. Ranj se khugar hua insa to mit jata hai ranj. Mushkile mush par padi itni ke aasan ho gayi. This is something that I remembered as I was listening to the conversation that Raju and you were having. So yeah, I hope that was that helped to answer Milia's question a little bit.
Thank you so much. Very insightful answers, and thank you so much. It did answer my question.
Dr. Chaturvedi and then Jan Helge.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Shruti, for giving me opportunity. My question may sound a bit childish. When I was listening Dr. Dengle, see, hunger artist, he's very helpless, and he is feeling this helpless for a period of time. He's continuing with his act. It reminded me of the poetry written by Rilke, The Panther, Behind the Bars. He is also helpless. He is also feeling helplessness. do we find some relationship or some similarity or some cause which we can relate here and explain? It may be very childish. I'm sorry to raise this question.
No, I mean, no, thank you so much. I mean, I have also thought on those lines, and Rilke's Panther I've translated into Hindi.
Wow.
And
Can you share this with me?
yeah, it is, Devendra Chobe has edited this Vishwa Sahitya Ki Chuninda Kavitaएं.
Acha.
In that, I have translated two of Rilke's Zolange du Selbstgeworfen ist Fängst and Der Panther.
Could we have the PDF davon haben?
Sorry?
Can I have the PDF of these translations?
That I don't know. I mean, but Devendra Chobe is still active in the field in JNU, and he may be able to make a copy available to you.
How please,
Yeah.
I would love to read that.
Yeah, he's in the Hindi Center of the School of Language, Literature and Culture Studies of JNU. Devendra Chobe. And the translated poem, the De Panther, is Bah Tendua. And, it was part of our teaching program also when we say, see, the earlier translations of De Panther did not understand the last relationship between the what are they called? Die Stäbe, no? And the Panther. So the thing is, it says, if I remember correctly, vom Vorübergehen der Stäbe. Sein Blick ist so müde geworden vom Vorübergehen der Stäbe. So der Stäbe is genitive. So it is it is the Vorübergehen der Stäbe. And the earlier translations of Der Panther did not get it. They focused only on this, but whereas the Panther is steady, as it were, the bars of the cage are moving. What it means theoretically also, the object becoming the subject and so on and so forth. I didn't want to talk about, but I think Milind has also referred to Hemant Bar's thing, and I have, while doing this, while reading Rilke and all that, often thought of Ernst Mach and das Unrettbare Ich. That these are the things that I thought about. But comparing the two, I truly wonder how, for this the Panther as that's the established interpretation that it's the story of the artist caged in Jardin de Planté or whatever, and whereas this Hungerkünstler, what is the art and what is this artist that we are talking about, he's not even moving his, what is his art? That is, I think, a point which would make the difference between the two clear. And if I have the Panther at the back of my mind, and if I'm reading Hungerkünstler, obviously that Panther is going to interfere, and so I mean, one can if one wanted to. But my point was, as I was trying to say, was because Andre Alt seemed hell-bent on talking about the Schopenhauerian influence on Kafka, particularly in the context of Hungerkünstler, and calling him a pessimist, which I was trying to sort of problematize, and that's why this reference to Yalom also, and this whole business of the phronetic shift in Schopenhauer himself, that that if I have understood this entire discourse of pessimism, of futility, of suffering, and so on and so forth, do I allow it to continue, or do I have the possibility of acting differently? How do I receive this discourse of suffering myself? That is, I think, the point which is very important. And what I am interested primarily is this shift that happens, where I I may have been suicidal 10 times, thousands of times in my life, but not committing this suicide, continuing to live. Why? What is the reason, you know? And so every time there is that shift, every time there is that turn that you take while walking or climbing or whatever it is, what is the story of life? Does it change? What is it that remains the same? What is it that changes? And I think Hunger Künstler does it wonderfully well, because you know, you have sort of deleted that entire spectrum of you know, the reception dependency of the artist, if you at all want to call him an artist, that he's not bothered about how his art is received, he's not bothered about approval and so on and so forth. And so it is he and his own. What is it? Discovering this tyranny of oneself that is, it's constantly telling him what to do. This is, I think, something which I am fascinated with, you know, and whether that and how that relationship between these two selves, so to speak, whether that relationship can change. If it doesn't change, then it is liable to perpetuate itself. And then you are simply going to transfer it to Andy Nageboren, you know. So
Milind wanted to maybe just answer the question as well.
Jan Helge had put up his hand, but Jan Helge, I just wanted to say something about the Panther, because the Hunger Künstler, the hunger artist actually ends by the circus removing the hunger artist and putting a panther there.
yeah.
And maybe there is an intertextual reference, because I think the Panther, the poem by Rilke precedes the hunger artist, I think, in terms of its genesis. It is probably an earlier poem. I mean, it's chronologically earlier, and Kafka might have read it, might have been aware of it, actually.
Yes.
And the hunger artist is replaced by a panther in this thing.
Thanks a lot.
Jan Helge?
Yeah, I'm still thinking about the first question of the audience, so to speak. Emilia, I think, asked it, like, where does this writing come from? And then maybe connecting it to this opacity of the writing. I mean, one can, of course, make or see many references or influences from like turn of the century authors and onwards. Rilke, for example, just being mentioned here. But like when it comes to the war, the First World War, I think that Kafka, in like from most scholars and most scholarly articles that I'm aware of, is much more influenced by his work actually than the political and, you know, surroundings of his time. His work being in a very, like, working in a very boring insurance company during the day, and this kind of codified world, this way of making sense of very odd things happening in reality that has to fit into a certain legal paragraph, and then a certain rule needs to be applied correctly so that the insurance company pays or doesn't pay, or how much do they pay. I think this absurdity, I mean, I am in India, absurd bureaucracy is something that is well in life. The point being that this kind of absurdity in modernity is something that I would see very clearly represented in his work, which he did and obviously enjoyed very much, or not, because he was writing these stories. And the second thing is to the opacity. I mean, this is something, of course, that for me personally means that I am not a lover like directly of Kafka, because I always think, just tell me what you want to tell me. Don't make it so opaque. But in a positive way, I mean, I can give you, I mean, this opacity leads to everybody being able to provide their own meaning, to fill the perceived lack or the perceived space that is there with something of their own. And that is a very fruitful exercise. The last time I read about the hunger artist was actually in Peter Sloterdijk's very well-received book, You Must Change Your Life, also widely available in English, where he puts, like, the whole book, You Must Change Your Life, is about humanity in the 20th century or the late 19th century turning into a planet of exercising people. Like everybody is now like training for the Olympic Games or taking care of their body or exercising in so many various ways. You have to climb Mount Everest, you have to do everything. And in that book, Sloterdijk puts the hunger artist in the perspective of actually not having a god, not having a religious superstructure anymore to actually fast for. I mean, fasting is in various, also Indian contexts, associated very much with a spiritual practice or exercise. And this hunger artist has removed all this, and he is doing it, as Sloterdijk points out, because of an inward tendency not to want to eat the food that is available to him. So he is, so to speak, just doing it because he can, like the way Mount Everest is scaled because it's there, and this kind of thinking from Sloterdijk's perspective. So Sloterdijk, I'm saying this because Sloterdijk puts the story into his context, and it works perfectly. And somebody else like Milia in the audience in a paper for homework or something can put it in a very different context, and it will also work. And this is something that you can love about the texts of Kafka or be a little bit suspicious of, like myself.
Yes, Professor Dengle, would you like to respond to Jan's
thank you for
question?
this, the Sloterdijk reference. I have not seen that, but
it's also very short. It's like 5 pages in a 600 page volume, so it's not that central.
Yeah.
Just so that we don't forget the point. Thank you, Jan Helge. It was a very important point, and it also actually then gives us precisely, I mean, it actually adds to the argument of opacity in that sense. Yeah. But coming back to the Panther, yeah, I'm so thankful to Shipraji for this observation, because it is indeed a very important point. As Milind also pointed out, it was Rilke. Rilke was actually responding, or it could be looked as a sequel of Hunger Künstler almost, because it ends there. The Hunger Künstler ends where the Panther comes in. And we're talking about, we had this lovely discussion. I don't know if Abhishek, are you there? And we were talking about, on the one hand, there is the hunger artist. And Abhishek said in our class last time, he said, oh, the Panther seems like the hungry artist. Beautiful wordplay, I feel. And it is actually indeed what happens here in Rilke's text also, is that he's actually then also critiquing the fact that is it really, is bringing in the animality all about the élan vital, really. And I think there are a lot of things that one can talk about when we look at the Panther from the perspective of animal studies. It can be a critique of using animals in that sense, which we have already seen in the Report to an Academy, for example. So that discussion could be then also again taken up. There's many ways of looking at it, and I find this very fascinating. Abhishek, you're there. Milind, I'd like to ask Abhishek to unmute himself, please. Just a second. Please, Abhishek, please.
Yes, good evening all. I'm so sorry I could not unmute myself earlier. The point that I made last time as well, it was the imposition of the hungry artist, that is the Panther, at the very end as compared to the hunger artist. And this was the point. This was essentially the point as well summarized by ma'am. But there was another point that I had, and this was actually what Professor Dengle had already talked about a few lectures ago, when he talked about what being human is. When we had had the discussion on the metamorphosis, Professor Dengle had talked about what being human and then morphing into an insect or an Ungeziefer was. Now, similarly, herein again we find his art form to be very unique, in the sense that him just not eating becomes an art form, a unique art form. And this is something that we see in prevalent times as well. We have competitors now who try to hold their breath underwater, and that also becomes art. So this again relates to what sir had said earlier as well. What is art then? Because just staying underwater and just not breathing whilst inside the water becomes art. So it's a spectrum of art then. Just a comment.
Yeah, Kunst also comes from Können. No? so ability to do something, the ability to fast, and so on, the ability to hold your breath underwater for a long period of time. I mean, you see, the moment you use this word Kunst, you know, it really is something which makes you think. I mean, what is the Kunst like? What is art like in fasting? And you know, anyway.
Milind and then Akshay.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out one other aspect that Raju touched upon while discussing Rubinstein's work on the hunger artist, and that is the point of communication. And I mean, I'm quoting what I've written down here, that the artist seems to progressively move further away from communication with the public. Although there is very clearly in the hunger artist, in the story, it's very clear that he wants to communicate whatever it is that he wants to communicate, which is the motivating factor behind his art. And yet he seems to be going constantly. I think I'm connecting this with, actually Om Prakash is sitting here, so I'm going to connect it with Om Prakash's work on the ideal reader and the participative reader at Saridayata. I think that is what it is. And Raju also mentioned that it challenges him as a reader to reach into his imagination. I think that kind of a participative reader also is implied in a work like The Hunger Artist. That is something that I wanted to just mention when Raju talked about the paradox of communication as it comes to as it is expressed in The Hunger Artist. So that also requires the public to be actually receptive to what exactly the art is that he wants to.
Yeah. Although, I mean, there's a reference in the text always to the word, the world goes on, you know, it's always, the world never stays there. That's the tragedy of the artist, you know. I mean, obviously this is, I don't know if it is wishful thinking, you know, this is really, as an artist, whether we can expect an audience to understand our art, or whether we are relevant all the time. I don't know, you know. That's perhaps something that also is then questioned perhaps in this text. Akshay, please.
Hello, sir. Thanks a lot. Milind, sir, thanks a lot. Everyone, thanks a lot. Sir knows, sir, one of my favorite lines of Kafka's from Aufbruch is "Weg von hier, das ist mein Ziel." You know? And but I don't feel so. I don't feel attached to those lines currently because of this wonderful constellation of thoughts happening. I don't know. I'm going back again to the positivistic causality framework, and maybe we've discussed a lot on that. But you know, just to bring in a small context, there's a very interesting passage in Rainer Stach's, you know, trilogy, biographical trilogy, a very, very important work. And this is the third part. Die Jahre der Erkenntnis, and where at the beginning Rainer Stach talks about the First World War, and he says in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you know, the government introduced a certain kind of Kriegsanleihe. So you know, the Bürger, the citizens would give money like bonds. You buy the war bonds basically from the government. And then after, obviously with the hope that, that when Austro-Hungarian Empire would win the war, the money will be given back with profit, with dividends and with greater interest. And, you know, and we've been talked a lot about Kafka's, you know, critique of modernity, and rightly so. But as if Kafka was a very moralistic figure, you know, and when I read Rainer Stach, I was myself surprised. Kafka was excited by this. Kafka participated in it. Kafka wanted to go to the bond office and buy a few of his own bonds because he wanted to go get away. He needed money and he wanted to get away from the Arbeiterversicherungsfirma. He wanted to get away from Prague. And he's given wonderful figures over here. How many kronen if you invest, and then how much will you get back from the. So the point I'm trying to make is that Kafka participated in the world that he critiqued. He was not a moralist activist who stayed away from it saying, I will not do it and I will only criticize it in my works. And that complicates the relation between empirical world, artist's world, and the world of the literature that the artist is producing, and the world of the reader, because Milind sir also brought in the world of the reader along with Om Prakash. I don't think so. There is I mean, we've already problematized, but just one extra, probably perspective to it. Okay, it's not a linear, causality relation between context, artist, text, reader, or the other way around. I mean, it's so self-contradictory. Kafka critiquing something in his works and also participating the same profit-oriented pro-war kind of practical, pragmatic world of Austro-Hungarian Empire. It complicates the very personality of Kafka. It complicates the very personality of the artist in him also, perhaps, I don't know. I mean, you probably, if you can add up to it based on, it's an interesting observation. I was shocked to read something like this a few years back. Anyone? And sir?
I was somewhere else. I was just saying that, we are so into Kafka as a person, and the context and so on. I'm not disputing the importance of these questions. While I was engaging with Kafka, and particularly the Hungerkünstler and the other a few 3-4 texts that I had occasion to go through, and this whole business of shame and guilt, what is it that causes? And are these the circumstances which cause shame and guilt? Or is it something else that causes shame and guilt? You change the circumstances, shame and guilt, does it disappear? It seems to be something there, when and the Hungerkünstler who is made to turn inward, and so when I'm trying to sort of understand it, interpret it, and so on, and when I read other stuff, whatever so-called I mean, I was thinking of Mautner's Gottlose Mystik and so on and so forth. There are, see, please let us not also, you're talking about Kafka, let's not also forget the fact which you see in his biography, that Kafka was attracted to theosophy, Rudolf Steiner and so on and so forth. I mean, that quest to for that kind of, that Faustian kind of thing is very much there. What is it? And so you have, I mean, I have been given this ability to imagine. I need to use it while reading Kafka and actually try and get to the bottom of it. That bottom is an endless pit, I know, but try and go to it as close as possible, to find out where does this shame and guilt come from. Who asked me whether I wanted to be born? I just there, some name was given and something and so on. I have to ask these questions of myself, and I'm just not simply happy to have an explanation on the basis of certain things which are out there and so on and so forth. That understanding of Kafka was there maybe 25 years ago, sorry. But today, when I'm looking at it, the same explanations do not suffice. That is my problem. When I read Hungerkünstler today, and I'm trying to find out what it means to me today, I start seeing the Hungerkünstler everywhere. I whatever I see, I see this kind of a thing. The public, the impresario, the two young ladies, the watchers, the butchers, and so on and so forth, and this absolutely insane obsession with moving away from that to make a point to the world that, you know, I am different. And then the whole thing disappears. So the desire to be different from the rest of the world dissolves into a kind of acceptance that is something which I find is a movement away from this one reading of Schopenhauer to the other reading of Schopenhauer, where I find that this phronetic shift is so important. Unless, if I find that you are telling me how to live, I will not accept it if it's a conceptual lecture. You give me how to live, you know, you get up in the morning, 4 o'clock, do your Surya Namaskaras and so on and so on. I will not accept it. But if you show me suffering like this and insane and the insanity, then I am inspired to tackle. I become that, you know, to tackle this problem of opacity with the help of my imagination. What is it? And why should I stop? Who's there to stop me? I have no fear. And the point that I find in Benjamin is so interesting, and that I find that, you know, we're not sort of talking about that, is basically when you ask the question, what is born? And Benjamin is telling you that it is memory that is born. You know, it is memory that gets born. So what am I going to do with memory? How am I going to deal with memory? You know, and how am I going to deal with this business of time? You know, and these are things which I think Kafka was also seriously engaged with, I find, and so one can't simply brush them aside as unimportant, because I think time is an extraordinarily important thing that one needs to, so the quest of the I will forget all these, all words, but the state that the Hungerkünstler finds himself now, you know, is he is having to deal with the temporality and the speciality of his beingness himself in the cage. And this is, I think, something very important. You know, is time important, or, you know, should I only discuss in terms of time, or do I find that I'm getting closer to the space that this movement of this time and all the images and their movement and life and all that is embedded in? I think this shift is very important. You know, when I was doing this course on philosophy a little bit, Shruti also came and talked about Nietzsche and so on, and I was enormously, I was fascinated with Augustine, you know, and saying that, and when he's talking about finding God and whether it is possible for him to find God in time, you know, and then saying that actually being born is time is born are not two separate things. Consciousness and time are born together. They are not two separate things. Where does this understanding come from? This is the nature of the Kafka's questions to me, and that's why they become so difficult and unacceptable at times. You know, as you were saying earlier, Herr Weidemann, that, you know, you tell me what he's talking about, and then David Basta kind of a thing, you know. But let me not ask these questions which lead nowhere, and that is the thing. I mean, is there somewhere that I need to be rather than here and now? But anyway, Akshay has raised his hand.
No, I think that's an old hand, isn't it?
That's an old hand.
No, that's from the last. Let me lower it.
All right. My question would be then another. I mean, it's little related to the text. When we were reading The Hunger Artist, we got stuck at a point where the hunger artist is then, you know, after the 40-day, and he continues in the end, is towards the end, before he's about to die. And there is a man who comes and he says, well, it's done. And he comes out, and And then somehow he's very apologetic. He says, verzeihen Sie mir. He's saying, I'm sorry, please forgive me. I'll just read that little part where he says, certainly. So now this is a supervisor who's come. And it's a very, very interesting way. Finally, the cage caught the attention of a supervisor. And he asked the attendant why they had left this perfectly useful cage standing here unused with rotting straw inside. So they're not even aware that there is a man, a human being inside the cage. Nobody knew until one man, with the help of the table with the number on it, remembered the hunger artist. They pushed the straw around with a pole, and they didn't even have hands, so they had a pole, and found the hunger artist in there. Are you still fasting? The supervisor asked. When are you finally going to stop? Now the hunger artist says, forgive me everything, whispered the hunger artist. Only the supervisor, who was pressing his ear up against the cage, understood him. Certainly, said the supervisor, tapping his forehead with his finger in order to indicate to the spectators that the state of the hunger artist, the hunger artist was in. We forgive you. I always wanted you to admire my fasting, said the hunger artist. But we do admire it, said the supervisor obligingly. But you shouldn't admire it, said the hunger artist. Well, then we don't admire it, said the supervisor. But why shouldn't we admire it? Because I had to fast. I can't do anything else. That's what you also mentioned in your talk, said the hunger artist. Just look at you, said the supervisor. Why can't you do anything else? Because, said the hunger artist, lifting his head a little and with his lips pursed as if for a kiss, speaking right into the supervisor's ear so that he wouldn't miss anything, because I couldn't find a food which I enjoyed. I had found that if I had found that, believe me, I would not have made a spectacle of myself and would have eaten to my heart's content, like you and everyone else. Those were his last words. So now the question was, forgive me everything. What is he asking forgiveness for? Why does he say, forgive me everything?
Can I please, Shruti, ask you to read the next sentence also?
All right. And well, he says, I would not have made a spectacle of myself and would have eaten to my heart's content like you and everyone else. Those were his last words. But in his falling eyes, there was the firm, if no longer proud, conviction that he was continuing to fast.
I think that last sentence was very important for me when I read The Hunger Artist for the first time.
There's a conviction. He's not proud, but he's convinced that fasting. He was convinced of his fasting. But why is he asking for forgiveness?
How do you read it today, Milind? It's been some time that you...
The forgiveness that Shruti talks about, I think it is in his previous utterance. He says that had I found the food that I enjoyed, I would not have made a spectacle of myself like that. I mean, there is a certain sense of embarrassment about the fact that he is it's not a complete non-awareness of his temporal state at that point of time. But I mean, I don't read the Hunger Artist very differently from the way I read it earlier. And I mean, I thought I also felt a connect with the participative reader. I mean, Kafka actually making a case, quote unquote, for a participative reader for his work with the Hunger Artist. And there is one, Jan Helga again has handled, but there's one small text that I was also talking to Raju some time back about. When I saw the title of the talk, Opacity and Imagination, then there is this small parable in beim Bau der chinesischen Mauer, which is an emperor's message, eine kaiserliche Botschaft, which ends by saying that it's an entire metaphor of opacity in the sense of not being able to see what exactly it is that is being conveyed to you, the recipient. And then it ends by saying, but you, the recipient, sit at your window and imagine it for yourself when evening falls. That is the end of Eine Kaiserliche Botschaft. And that all these things to me point to a kind of appeal to the reader to come and participate in the discourse of the text. That is what I would. And I don't see it that differently today.
Thank you so much, Milind. I also, we were discussing it. Ankur, I don't know. Ankur, are you there? In fact, we were also discussing it the other day, and we were thinking as if it was almost like a role reversal. It is, I think, logically, it should have been the people who should have apologized, actually. That they forgot to keep account of the days that he was fasting. I mean, it was, and all of a sudden, it's the artist himself saying, "Oh, I'm really sorry." It is almost so absurd here. It is the writer definitely wants the reader to understand this the pain that is there, and perhaps the shamelessness. I mean, maybe you almost feel ashamed of what one did to the Hungerkünstler, but he's saying sorry himself. I don't know. Ankur, you were also there. Are you there?
Yes.
Yeah.
Also, Shruti, if I may, this the artist at this station in his life, saying that, if he had thought ever that his art, his
Ankur, please. Yeah, thank you.
That his, what he thought till now. Why you were asking, why is he asking for forgiveness? The idea that he was producing something, and that is actually the last straw, for someone, and so on and so forth. He's apologetic for that entire idea of art, if you want it like that. Asking for approval, for appreciation, for accolades from the public, and so on and so forth. That entire thing is wrong. That the aesthetic praxis is about something else. It is not about making someone happy or doing something for somebody else's sake. That entire. I think he is apologetic for that entire package that has to be that he's about to leave behind.
Very interesting. Jan Helge and Akshay.
Yeah, I wanted to say exactly the same thing, because in the context of the paragraph, it makes sense that he is apologizing for having thought that he wants the admiration, but now he realizes it's not an extrinsic motivation that drives him, but it's actually coming from within, and he should never have asked for the admiration. Like, that is clear, like, linguistically in the passage. But the thing is, it again points to Sloterdijk's point being very correct. Like, it's about exercise, it's intrinsic, there is, of course, and also this points to something that Akshay said earlier, like, of course it happens in an environment where in this particular circus traveling group, he is there as an attraction to make money, and that is part of a particular system. But the people that do sports theoretically should do it for the sport and not for being seen on TV cameras at the Olympic Games. It shouldn't be here I win and I run fast, but it should be like I am, doing my sport well. But we are in a context, and thus there are these, as was pointed out, these conflicts arising. That is just inevitable. And I think, Shruti, you see yourself sitting in that cage. Like, what you were saying is like, please, there's an artist, pay attention to them, please. That's the problem in that system, where also very correctly, hunger is seriously not a discipline for today. Yesterday or today I read 60% of Germans are overweight. The point is, it's just not today's discipline, and thus the crowd moves on, and you have to change your practice. You have to change what you are training for. If nobody wants to see soccer anymore, football or whatever, well, then you have to try cricket, or the other way around. It's just, that's the way it is.
The world moves
Shruti.
on. Yeah, Akshay.
No, just two quick points, and I'm sorry, Shruti. This is
And
not a
then-
question and answer session anymore. We are just, we've turned the whole table into a discussion round.
Well, which is a good thing, actually. I like it this way.
What Herr Weidmann said, it's so fantastic because just 2 days ago Ramzan ended, and this whole again the idea of fasting comes into the context again. Interestingly. Secondly, I thought of the film Guide. What Dengle sir also mentioned, before this round, and then somewhere intertextually it reminded me of Guide in the last scene, and the last scene where he's watching at that banana and and it's such a terrible scene, and yet it's such an important scene. And thirdly, I have mentioned this before many times. I will again mention it today. The context demands it. That I was again, surprised by Hesse. I was reading just, randomly a few years ago in JNU, Hermann Hesse's Notizen zu Literatur. And Kafka dies in 1924. So there is no question of Second World War there. But Hesse reads Kafka in 1930s, if I'm not wrong, 36, 37, something like that. So Hesse has written on Kafka. Somewhere I discovered in those Hesse whatever volumes. And he's saying very interestingly, something interesting about Fordham Gazettes before the law. Hesse says that it is for that man from the village that the door to justice or to Gericht or whatever it is closed or unattainable or completely, inaccessible. That doesn't mean the door is closed to the reader who's reading that story, Fordham Gazettes. And that's a very, very interesting insight by Hesse, because that connects me to again what Dengle sir said and what Milin sir said about the reader again, because when the reader comes into the whole equation, causality and positivistic biographical causality doesn't, they lose their charm because then a completely different world opens up of innumerable interpretations and intertextual interpretations for the reader, not to the world, not as a universal truth again to be presented in a book or a paper, but like sir said, for that particular reader. Approaching Kafka through Hesse was again, it shocked me because I have been trained to fit Kafka into existentialism, and then again untrained by sir over the years, and said, that's wrong. And the books are saying something else, but the methodological training says something else, and that's the fun part of it, actually, as a reader. Just a comment, sorry.
The only thing, Akshay, there is that I have not read Hesse on Kafka, by the way, but only thing is that in Fordham Gazettes, even for the man from London, even for the man from the village or the countryside, the door is open. It is not closed. The door is open. He can see inside.
Yeah. He can see the glance.
Yeah. So it is the door is open for him as well. And for the reader, of course, for the readers, all doors open up anyway. So it's
okay. Very interesting point. Ankur, did you want to say anything? Sorry, I forgot
yes,
you.
Professor,
Please.
Just before I start with a couple of themes that has been there in my mind about particularly about the story, The Hunger Artist. If I may share a personal anecdote. So around 2 years ago, when I was doing my master's in Ashoka University, I was sitting in an auditorium full of hundreds of students, and this particular Mumbai-based theater director called Gurleen Judge, she adapted Hunger Artist and she brought it to our university, and I got a chance to sort of see that play. And just before the play was about to start, a particular crew member in the team was video recording the entire audience. And I just couldn't make sense that why just before the play would begin, this person has to record the entire audience. And as soon as the camera came towards me, I started hiding. I was like this. I was hiding under the seat in that auditorium. Everybody else was sitting comfortably chatting to their friends, and I was hiding under the table. just because I didn't want to get recorded. And then the play finished, and the entire recording was played on the screen in this huge auditorium. This has been my, so when I was trying to hide myself, it just made it more and more apparent. And now I am faced with, in a situation where I'm sitting in this auditorium, the play has just ended, and these hundreds of students are just looking at me. As soon as they finished watching the play, everybody's looking at me that, what is this cartoon doing here? Why is he hiding under the seat? What's happening here? And it just became a huge joke. I just wanted to disappear. So this has always been the case with any room where Kafka just strikes hard, as it did today in this lecture by Professor Dengle, and in the discussion after that. Now, just to come to what you started, Professor. So if I could read just a couple of lines, about this notion of apology as you started it. I wonder, apology, of course, in itself, but especially from the supervisor, is playing the role for the protagonist, looking for someone to purge him of his guilt for doing what he's doing, suggesting that fallen artists lend themselves to organizations, hierarchies, and bureaucracies, and all that one is left with is an apology, that too ingrained with doubt. So the passage that you read, this theme of apology constantly, it's there in Kafka's writings, where he does not know what he's apologizing for. Just like maybe I did a couple of days ago, not knowing what this course was intended for, but I just apologized to you that I wasn't the best student here. I didn't put all my efforts in learning German. And then you said, no, this course is not about learning German. So I just need a supervisor, maybe, and that's the plight of the fallen artist. That is the condition of this character again. And about a discussion on interiority earlier, and this folding into itself, right? This is also very striking about this, that, of course, there is aesthetics of and notions of hunger and starvation, and this complex, spectrality. Is this artist in the prison, or everyone else outside? What is that prison, right? And also, I just couldn't sit comfortably during these last 2 hours. I was sitting like Red Peter did in that prison room, trembling, because it's like you're constantly figuring out which is the best body position to be in, so that you get maximum of this, so that you hear and receive maximum. I can't be in a comfortable chair listening to things like this, right? So I am hoping if Professor Dengle could say something about this notion of apology, as he and I hadn't make any notes, so excuse me for if I cite you wrongly, but then you provoke this notion of punishment, right? That this person, is he looking for that supervisor to he is looking for his own crime, right? Because that has ingrained into him, and that too with doubt. So that is also very important, because he's in a constant dilemma. So even though he's guilty, he's doubtful about it. Should he be guilty? That's also a question there. So that is one, and another thing. Maybe just if you could respond to that, Professor, and I'll add my follow-up question later. Thank you.
Professor Dengle he just called me and he's saying he's lost connectivity. So Milind, would you like to just briefly respond to this? I can see it is also time. And I wanted to show all of you something as a surprise, not just from, so I wanted to show you after that. Please, Milind, just please respond to what Ankur said.
Ankur, could you please just summarize your question? I'm trying to, because I was not expecting to answer it, so I was.
Yeah, absolutely, it's fine. Yeah, just this notion of apology, and that too vis-a-vis fallen artists. That is it the fallen artists that lend themselves to bureaucracies, organizations, and hierarchies, right? When the protagonist in Hunger Artist is apologizing to the supervisor, but not really being sure of it himself, that what is he apologizing for? And then, I mean, he, of course, is demanding that attention. It was said a while ago that he doesn't care. I mean, he absolutely cares. He absolutely cares for all the attention when he's trying to prove that, yes, these are the days, these have been the number of days that I've starved, I haven't eaten anything. And he's constantly calling the attention onto himself, because it's just like a child, not eating something so that his mother would give him what he wants. And if he were to eat something, he would do it in hiding. So and he's constantly doing that, so that even if he eats something, his mother shouldn't get to know that, because then the intensity of the protest has gone a little down. It's compromised.
I think Milind has got the question. Milind, would you like to respond?
So I think, but even during the talk, Raju is still not there. But I think even during the talk, Ankur, Professor Dengle did talk about the fact that there is a transition that comes about in the Hunger Artist's own understanding of his own art. And what you're saying, that yes, I mean, I have emphasized also that the desire on the part of the Hunger Artist to communicate whatever it is that he wants to come, and what this art is itself is a huge question. But anyway, whatever it is, that's why it becomes a metaphor for any artist, actually. That is the power of Kafka's metaphor. Okay, so the thing is that the desire to communicate whatever it is that he wants to communicate through his art is always there. And in the beginning, when he was a big star, when his show of fasting was one of the star attractions of the Variete, and so on and so forth, the impresario, he had his own manager. I mean, come on. Okay, so at that point of time, it mattered to him. It mattered to him what the public, what kind of a response the public was giving. There was that kind of a mutual relationship between the public and the artist. But as he went deeper and deeper into his art, I mean, this is, of course, everything we are only guessing in Kafka's case. Okay, as we read the text, we need to also understand that as he went deeper into the art, the entire, the notion of turning inward, which also was referred to by Professor Dengle, that then actually the art becomes an art for its, I mean, l'art pour art, just art for its own sake. And then the entire paraphernalia of the surroundings, it becomes just a prop, actually. And he is only interested in finding out how long he can fast. That's it. There's nothing else that bothers him. So eventually, when he apologizes to the supervisor, I think it is also a sense of, having taken up this space, actually. And now he probably is like the man from Landa, since Akshay has invoked podium gazettes. Like at the end of the story, the light streams forth from inside the law, even for the man from the countryside. So I think there is a sense of that in the Hunger Artist as well, that he has been unnecessarily occupying all these, whatever little space. I mean, he can't even be found in the straw that's there. So whatever little space he's occupying, and he just wants to, there's a Kabir there also.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm sure there is a lot to be discussed. And I think, you should also take the emails of the professors here, and, you should also get in touch with them. I want to quickly end this session. I'm looking at the watch. We've already, it's already 8:13, and I